of the School of Social Sciences Zeries. This is a series of talks that we've put together to spotlight the work of social and behavioral scientists at UCI as it relates to the current pandemic. This session is being recorded and it will be posted on the Social Sciences website after the event today. Also on the Social Sciences website, you can look at the past episodes in this series, which have featured faculty from political science, anthropology, and also a postdoctoral researcher whose work is at the intersection of public health and social science. So you're welcome to check those out. They're all up on the Social Sciences website at socsci.uci.edu. Today, we are joined by Professor Sara Mednick from the Department of Cognitive Sciences. Professor Mednick is going to speak on sleep and the COVID crisis. She is, her research has been funded by the National Institutes of Health, among other agencies, and has won awards. She is the author of the book, Take a Nap, Change Your Life. I brought my pillow. It's over there. You can't see it behind the background, so I'm going to get comfy in a bit as we hear from Professor Mednick. If you're unfamiliar with this webinar format in Zoom, you can post a question at any time by going down to the bottom of your window and clicking on the Q&A balloons. Okay, so click on Q&A at any time and post a question. I'll try to keep track of those, and after Professor Mednick's presentation, I'll give her some of those questions. I'll read them out loud so she can respond. And again, thank you all so much for being here. And with that, I will just hand it off to Professor Mednick.
Hello, everybody. So should I start screen sharing right now?
Yes, you should.
All right, let's do this.
And I should say too that this morning we've been having some connectivity issues. So if that happens, please bear with us. We're all, in this together, and we all have varying degrees of bandwidth and connection from time to time. So just be patient if there's any problems, and thanks.
Yeah, I will say my undergraduates have to be rather patient with me because there's many people who share my modem, unfortunately. Okay, so thank you so much for having me come in and put together this talk on sleep during the COVID crisis. It's, I run a sleep lab at UCI, but it's a lab that looks at the mechanisms of memory consolidation. So I don't really look at the effect of sleep during stress. And so it's really exciting to be able to dive into a new topic and try to figure out, what is going on, especially in a world where we don't have the data. We don't have studies that have been done. It's all happening right now. So trying to pull together what we already know about sleep and then the few bits of data that are coming out and trying to put those ideas together. So this is going to be kind of a hodgepodge of a lot of different ideas of things I think are important to consider. So the overview, actually, before I went into the overview, I just want to put a shout out to Bill Maurer because our dean has been amazing. I know that many different faculty are dealing with a lot of different, they have a lot of different ways of dealing with how to, adapt to these new circumstances, but I just have really enjoyed Bill's approach because it's first super compassionate and empathetic and very patient and also extremely supportive and just with as much info as you want. And then, take or leave what you need, and also very understanding. So thank you, Bill. I just want you to know. Okay, so let's talk about the overview. So what are we going to talk about today? First of all, I just want to talk about what we probably all think about, right? Is what is happening to our sleep during the lockdown. In particular, what's happening to our dreams. Because this is actually some of the only data is that there's some institutes of dreaming and they're coming up with new data on what's happening to sleep by looking at dreams. We're also going to look at what's the effect of sleep deprivation because part of the effect of COVID is that people aren't sleeping as well, right? So I'm going to turn to some basic research that looks at the effect of sleep deprivation, sleep restriction on emotions, cognition, and health, just to sort of give you a sense of what the impacts of not sleeping well during COVID may be. And then ending with some practical steps to harness the power of sleep to get you back on track if you've lost your track. All right, so sleep during COVID. Now, of course, there's no way you can capture how sleep is changing across every individual. The thing that's so important to think about sleep is that everyone really is their own snowflake. There are types, but really people have their own sleep style. And they have their own chronotype, which means, are they morning people or evening people? They have their own sleep duration needs, right? Some people are short sleepers. They could sleep for 5 hours a night and they'd be fine. Other people need 7.5 hours and other people need 10 hours. It's really, some people are nappers, some people are not nappers. And this is not, so there's no one size fits all for sleep. So in talking about how sleep changes during COVID, it's really important to think that it changes for everyone, but it changes in different ways. And it changes for children, as well as adults, and probably also older adults. There's less information on older adults because they're not as much online. So some people are sleeping less, to the point where some people are saying that they may have insomnia, and insomnia is, a chronic. It can be either acute, whereas like within 1 year you have problems sleeping 3 to 4 times a week. And then if that persists beyond a year, it can become chronic. And insomnia is a important disorder that is related to depression and anxiety and a lot of other health problems. So it's a pretty critical thing to think about. Some people are sleeping more. And of course, this is because they are no longer having to go to work in the morning, right? And so they don't necessarily have to wake up at 6 a.m. But of course, sleeping too long can be a sign of depression. And of course, when we're now in this state, it's very important to be thinking about how our emotional health may be impacting our sleep and vice versa. Some people have shifted their sleep to later bedtimes and later rise times. And this is called a circadian phase delay, where basically your own internal clock is shifted so that you're going to sleep later and also waking up later. And there's really nothing wrong with that if this suits you and this is part of your natural circadian rhythm, because you're still getting the right amount of sleep. It's just shifted. But some people have shifted to a later bedtime, but they retain this early rise time, because a lot of children who are kind of pre-adolescent children, they will wake up like clockwork, right, at 6 a.m., no matter whether they've shifted to going to sleep later, right, which is around 9 p.m. A lot of kids are now staying up a little bit later, right? And even me as a sleep researcher, I'm letting my son go to sleep at 9 p.m., but he still wakes me up at 6 a.m. So we're both kind of getting the short end on that one. So that's another issue, right, is that our bedtimes are shifting, but we are not necessarily shifting our rise times. And also nightmares have increased, and we're also going to talk about that. So let's look at each one of these individually. So insomnia is a sleep disorder that typically occurs or is found acutely, basically showing within 1 year, 20 to 30% of Americans have acute insomnia. And a much smaller percentage of that, it's, some studies show around 6% become chronic, but some studies show a little bit larger than that. So what's happening during the lockdown? Oops, hold on. There we go. So, of course, as I said, it's too soon to really rely on too much data because number one, the data hasn't been collected or is being collected right now. There's a lot of sleep surveys that are now happening, but we don't have that, that research in. But what we do have is text detection or text analysis of Twitter and Facebook and different hashtags. And so that's being used now to assess whether people are expressing more sort of sleep crisis, sleep problems. And these are some of the hashtags that are often being used now, and there's a definite rise in bad COVID sleep type of hashtags. There was a really interesting researcher that did the text analysis of Twitter and showed that people who appear to be tweeters, who are ones who are using these kind of hashtags, are people who are active during sleeping hours between 6 p.m. and 6 a.m. That's when they're doing their most activity. But they're also people who seem to be more isolated. They have less followers. They follow less people. They're also less active in general, but the time they're active is at night. And their tweets seem to have a significantly greater amount of negative content. So that's that connection between insomnia and depression. And you can see that, people's expressions on Twitter represent, what their actions in terms of, when they're actually awake and what that's doing to their emotions. There was a really interesting study in Chinese medical staff, and this was actually one of the first studies I saw coming out, which is showing that at this point, they're showing a 36%. This is actually in the medical staff. So this is a very different population, right? These are people who are first responders, who are really, the people who are dealing with the crisis directly. And in that group, doctors and nurses are showing 36% rates of insomnia. So significantly more than the 20 or so that we usually see. And the insomnia is usually related to high levels of anxiety and depression, and also trauma experiences. There was some interesting differences between nurses and doctors. Nurses have more insomnia, and their insomnia seems to be related to greater fears of the virus, and also lower levels of education, but I think that's confounded with the fact that it's comparing nurses and doctors. The most important thing is that what they were saying is that the nurses are the ones with more exposure, more exposure time with people with the virus. And so they are in a more dangerous situation. And so it seems the fact that there is this difference where nurses actually have more depression, more anxiety, more insomnia does seem related to the amount of exposure that they have. So what about everybody else? People on lockdown. That's, for the people who are now expressing more of these hashtags, or people who are expressing more symptoms of insomnia, is likely due to high levels of anxiety, right, that are keeping us up at night, but also low activity during the day. I know that everyone is out there walking their dogs, 5 times a day, as Bill once said, but it's not the same. It's not enough, because we're also in the middle, we're in our offices, our home offices all day long instead of being outside enough. And so we're not getting sunlight, which is an important trigger for circadian rhythm. We also are experiencing more screen time at night, which is going to keep our alertness higher and harder for us to actually get that good melatonin increases that help us go to sleep at night. And this insomnia, we're going to segue into the dreaming discussion, right? The insomnia in the middle of the night is actually increasing the likelihood that our dreams are being remembered, because when you have light sleep, you wake up and you can actually remember what you were just experiencing, as opposed to this nice deep sleep that kind of you wake up and you feel like you didn't dream at all. If you have light, restless sleep, you're more likely to remember your dreams. So let's look at what are the dreams that people are reporting in during the COVID lockdown. So there are active institutes that follow dreams. And so they have people doing dream reports. And what they found is a 35% increase in dream recall. And so, that may be related to the fact that there's a greater amount of insomnia and greater amount of restlessness during the night, so that people are more able to remember their dreams. And specifically, there's a 15% increase in negative dreams. And so if you look at the content of those dreams, what are people saying? interesting features that are common across many dreams is that they're associating hugging with danger or menace. And there's people, who say that when they experience that somebody is coming up to them and wants to hug them, and they basically are screaming like, "Oh, you're going to hurt me, you're going to kill me," in this dream where, there's like the zombie hug, right? It's just a new way of shifting our impressions about something that was obviously had a completely different valence before. There's also more anxiety in dreams around going to restaurants, contamination, and being around people and food. And then fears of the novel coronavirus are projected onto threats like zombies, bugs, and shadowy figures. So obviously that's a kind of a general fear that there's some sort of menace. And then I thought most sort of frightening was to read about the medical workers' dreams, because it seems that their dreams the nightmares really have a huge content in infecting their children, fear of infecting their own children and having to watch what happens, and that they would be responsible for that. And we all, of course, know the intense amount of work that people do to go from work to home in these situations, and you can imagine how that can infect your subconscious when you're sleeping. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit now about kind of the college age, because here are university professors, and hopefully some of our students are watching and trying to figure out what's going on with their sleep. And this is a important kind of a figure that looks at sleep across the lifespan, and it looks at the amount of each sleep stage. And I'm not going to get into the sleep stages very much because there's more to talk about. But on the x-axis, it's age, right? So from age 5 up to age 85. And then on the y-axis, you see the quantities of different types of sleep. And just so you know, what we call the really restorative sleep is this SWS, slow wave sleep. And if you look at this area right here, which is really adolescence and high school to college age kids, what you see is that sleep in general decreases, but it's really because of a decrease in slow wave sleep that you see this kind of big ramping down of slow wave sleep. And slow wave sleep is where a lot of our most restorative sleep benefits occur. It's also placed in the first part of the night. So when we go to sleep, the first thing we go into is slow wave sleep. And it's dependent on how much you've slept, how long you've been awake and how much you slept before, but it's also really dependent on time of the night. So if you start to go to sleep later and later in the night, you're going to have less slow wave sleep, because you're going to then go into the other stage of sleep that's really important, which is REM sleep. And you're going to start to have more REM sleep, which is in the early morning. So if you start shifting your bedtime later and later and later, you're going to miss out on more of this slow wave sleep restorative process. So let's just look at what happens to our circadian rhythm, which is our internal clock that tells us when to be alert and when to be sleeping across the lifespan. So now we're going to switch to looking at this as, this is time of day on the x-axis. So it's in military time, but it doesn't really matter, European time. So this is basically when most adults are going to sleep. They go to sleep at around 11 p.m., which is the 23 mark, and they wake up at around 7. Now that's sort of, in general. Obviously there's morning people and there's night people, and these people are very different in terms of what their sleep times are, but the majority of people have this adult circadian sleep phase, it's called. But what happens in adolescence, and I'm sure everybody who's listening who's had kids or is a kid knows what this is that you start to actually have what's called a circadian phase shift, where your bedtime gets shifted to later and later and later. But of course, the problem with having your bedtime get shifted later and later and want to go to sleep, say at 2 a.m., here, and we're talking around, 13 to even up to like 26 years old, right? Is that school start times are still asking you to wake up at around 7 or 6 o'clock, right? So what happens to a lot of high school students is that they're getting the short shrift in terms of they could lose like 3 hours of sleep every night because they have to be up early, but they cannot physically get to sleep until later. Interestingly, then we get out of this phase, we go into our adult phase, but then when we go to into older adulthood, we actually have a phase advance, which means that we actually need to go to sleep earlier. And older adults actually get sleepy earlier, and then they wake up much earlier as well. But what's interesting is, of course, even though older adults get sleepier earlier, they don't necessarily let themselves go to sleep at that time. So they also have a problem because they try to go to sleep at they try to maintain their old time because that's what everybody else wants them to go to sleep, but then they also get less sleep because then they're sleeping much less, right? So this is the problem with being out of sync with your own internal rhythm. If adolescents could go to sleep at 2 a.m. and wake up at 11 a.m., that actually may be best for them. So what happens, there's something called delayed sleep phase syndrome. And this is what happens to many, many college students and high schoolers. They get this delayed sleep phase, which is this natural tendency to want to go to sleep later and wake up later. And here it is a figure, which is it's a latency to sleep test, where basically you just allow people to try to take a nap at different times of day, and you see how long does it take this person to fall asleep. So early adolescents who are before their delayed sleep phase syndrome, they can take, in the middle of the day, time of day is 9:30 a.m. to like 7:30 p.m., right? In the middle of the day, they've slept well. They don't really fall asleep very easily. It takes them about 20 minutes to fall asleep in the middle of the day. But college students, they're out, right? There's less than 5 minutes to fall asleep at any time during the day, which is a sign that they probably are sleep deprived. And there's no surprise there, but that college students are sleep deprived. And of course, the consequences of the poor sleep patterns is poor sleep quality, difficulty falling asleep, waking up in the morning, fragmented sleep. All of this can make you extremely sleepy during the day. It can also create that fatigue levels that put you at risk for accidents, falling asleep while driving, operating machinery when you shouldn't be. There's lots of just making mistakes, right? Not being as on, making mistakes when you're doing your work or when you're thinking or where you're driving, and poor school performance. So the kids who are at most risk for this delayed sleep phase syndrome usually are the ones who are doing the worst in school, because schools don't really know that much about this kind of research, other than PTAs bringing this to them and saying we need to change the school start times. But a lot of schools start earlier and earlier as the kids get older and older, and they put all their hardest classes in the morning because that's when the kids are supposed to be freshest. But then for the kids who are not fresh, they're actually failing. So, and then there's, of course, negativity, irritability. There's some really interesting research looking at kids who have been diagnosed with ADD, attention deficit disorder, and attention deficit and hyperactivity disorder, and showing that in some of these cases, if you just extend the amount of sleep that these kids are getting, a lot of these symptoms of AD and ADHD decrease and become asymptomatic. So there's some confounds with a lot of kind of adolescent clinical stuff with not understanding sleep, the effects of sleep. And of course, there's a big thing that happens in college is an increase in use of stimulants, in particular non-medical use of stimulants. And we've been looking at this research as well as showing how, the kids who are turning to using Adderall Ritalin who have not been diagnosed with ADHD, what happens to them cognitively and what happens to them in school. And it doesn't look like these drugs are actually doing what people think they're doing. They're not what we call smart drugs. They're keeping people awake, but not necessarily keeping them smarter. Okay, so that was the background. So now what's happening during lockdown, right? How do we look at all these different types of sleep changes and what's happening? So what's interesting is college students are probably sleeping better than they ever have during the lockdown, is you know, logically following through, right? Because they can decide on when to be in their classes. A lot of the time, these classes, they don't have early classes anymore because they can watch their videos when they want. So they can set up their own schedule, and it allows them to sleep longer and to get in sync with their own internal circadian rhythm. So interestingly, I think that college students may be benefiting the most out of the lockdown. But the issue with sleeping in is that you sleep in during the morning, and that is a period of time with the most amount of rapid eye movement sleep, which is where we have our most amount of dreams. And dreams, when we say dreams, I also mean nightmares, right? So there is a potential for there to be increased nightmares if you're sleeping in and you're highly anxious. So that's one caveat. The other thing to think about is that oversleeping, sleeping longer, and longer amounts of REM sleep in particular have been related to feeling strong emotionality, negative emotions, but also seeping into depression. So in depression, people usually have oversleep, and they have a lot of REM sleep. So there's a little bit, and given that we're in this highly emotional time, stressful time of a lot of uncertainty, I think it's important just to think about whether the sleep that you're getting, even though it may be more than what you usually get, whether it may be contributing to high levels of emotionality. And so, you know, one potential response for that would be to actually not let yourself sleep in, to try to go to sleep earlier, to not have so much REM sleep, is one potential response. So who here wants to raise their hand and say that they're parents with young kids who may be suffering? Because there's so many reasons. Let's just go over them. So we are not working during the day like we expect ourselves to. So our levels of expectation of our workflow is obviously extremely lessened. And that can have an emotional a cost, is to be so out of sync with what you expect of yourself. But it also means that you're going to more likely find to have, create time during the middle of the night to work. My postdoc was writing her grant. She has a 2-year-old baby, and she was writing her grant between the hours, I forgot what she said, something crazy like between the hours of like 9 p.m. and 3 a.m. were her work hours. And it was, she's a sleep researcher. So, and then even for people who may not necessarily need to work at night, there's still this kind of quality of that you've been in service to your children all day long. And so you want to finally have your alone time. And so you may indulge in a lot of activities that will A, keep you up at night, and B, keep you stressed because it's a lot of reading the news, and C, expose you to a lot of blue light from your screen, which also sends signals to your circadian rhythm that it's not nighttime. And so it makes it harder to go to sleep. For me personally, I have really experienced this big shift where if I don't catch the wave of going to sleep around 10, or maybe even a little bit earlier, then there's no chance of me going to sleep until I don't know when. Like that there's these, because sleep happens in these kind of cycles. and that's a whole other conversation, but there are these cycles, and just maybe consider when is the best cycle for you to go to sleep and really try to hit that mark. There's increased alcohol consumption. I don't know who's doing that, but I'm sure somebody is. And that degrades sleep. Alcohol may be the kind of thing that relaxes you and helps you, go to sleep maybe, but it actually takes away your REM sleep. And so that early morning sleep, so you're gonna have a lot more middle of the night wakenings and difficulty getting back to sleep. And as I mentioned, my son, 6-year-old, he can go to sleep later, but he still is the rooster who crows at 6 at dawn. And so that's going to have a huge impact on our ability. If we stay up later as well, then no matter what, we're still getting up at 6 a.m. Okay, so moving on to, actually, can I just ask how much more time do I have? I haven't really been tracking myself.
We've got 15 more minutes so that we can leave time for questions.
Awesome.
But you can also wrap up quicker than that too, because there's a couple questions that have come in already.
Okay.
Okay, so go ahead.
Yeah, I want to get to some of the immunity stuff. So there's some really interesting stuff with immunity. So I'm going to go through this maybe a little bit quicker, but basically sleep is important for not only emotions, but also cognition. And I can talk about cognition for 10 hours, but we're just going to show one little graph here, which is that when you're when you're given an opportunity to sleep, this is the white bar. And when you're given an opportunity to not sleep, your performance is way better when you've slept compared to when you haven't slept. Okay, so in this case, this is a bunch of different stimuli. It's pictures that are either very negative pictures, very positive pictures, or neutral emotion pictures. And now this is all stimulus types, and now we're just going to break it up. And what's interesting is that you find this kind of benefit of sleep for both the positive and the neutral, where you kind of, when you're sleep deprived, you forget the positive things that happen. When you're sleep deprived, you forget a lot of the things that maybe are neutral and they don't matter. But interestingly, when you are sleep deprived, you don't forget negative things. You seem to have a bias towards retaining information that is negative in nature. This is maybe one idea around what is contributing to people's feeling just, on a daily basis right now, quite anxious and depressed, is if we're not sleeping very well, then we may be suffering from this interesting effect of holding on to negative information more so than we hold on to positive information. And one potential reason for this is that there's an area of the brain called the amygdala, and the amygdala is the area that processes our fears and our negative emotions. And when the brain is sleep deprived, the amygdala is extremely overactive. So in this case, we have a sleep group here, and this is the amygdala activation to negative imagery. You see that when you well slept, your amygdala goes down after, it decreases in activation after it's seen an emotional stimulus before. It says, oh, I've seen that before. I've learned that it's not that bad, and I'm kind of moving on, right? But if you're sleep deprived, when you see this emotional stimulus a couple of times, your amygdala actually becomes more active. So that gives us an idea that when we're sleep deprived, we're in a very emotional brain state that doesn't necessarily have the ability to think in a balanced way, right? We are overemphasizing the negative experiences, and our fear brain is more in control than when we're well rested. What about our health? So there's many different ways we could be looking at this, but some of the typical ways of looking at this is different hormones and the difference between the production of hormones when you're sleeping versus the production of hormones when you're kept awake or sleep deprived. And some very important hormones are growth hormone. This is a hormone that's incredibly important for tissue repair, muscle building. Prolactin is important for lactation, reproductive health. Cortisol is a very important stress hormone that usually should be going to, so I'll just go through them. So growth hormone has, the only time we see a peak in growth hormone is during slow wave sleep, during that first part of the night. So this figure is time of day on the x-axis, and this is 11 p.m. till whatever that is, 7 a.m. And what you see is when people have slept, you see a big spike in growth hormone, and it's followed by a big spike in prolactin. And this is when you're well slept. But when you're sleep deprived, there's nothing that happens, right? So all of these very restorative processes that are important for growth, for immune function, for the rest and digest functions, reproductive health, cardiac and metabolic function, all of these are not allowed to replenish themselves because they only happen during sleep, and specifically during that early night slow wave sleep. Whereas in cortisol, what you see is with normal sleep, partial sleep deprivation, and total sleep deprivation, the less you're sleeping, the more cortisol you have in the middle of the night. And cortisol is a stress hormone, and it's related to your sympathetic nervous system, and it's related to arousal. So the more cortisol you have, the more arousal you have at night, and the less of this, you know, your immune system is very much dependent on having decreased cortisol at night. So having too much cortisol at night means that your immune function is also going to be low. So poor sleep decreases levels of repairing, replenishing chemicals, and stress chemicals stay elevated. With chronic conditions of this type, you increase your risk for autonomic imbalance, which is having too much of the fight or flight state of the mind and body, and not enough of the rest and digest. And that leads to potential for all sorts of chronic diseases, diabetes, heart disease, and also early death. So this, it's very important to think about, you know, getting early sleep so that these processes can be allowed. All right, let's see. Now, I want to end on immunity because it's quite interesting that now we're thinking about how much, you know, about viruses, right? And about acquiring immunity with vaccinations, and also susceptibility to viruses. There's a large literature that is, or I would say a very growing literature, small but growing literature, looking at the effect of sleep on these processes. And just to start with, you know, the acquired response is the one where you actually have the pathogen, and this is like a virus, and that your body has to learn and create an immunological memory so that it can have a remaining memory in your body that whenever something else happens that is similar to that, it can build a response very rapidly, right? So we have the acquired response, and then there's the innate immunity, which is just the immediate sort of inflammatory responses that's not very specific. So during sleep, we create more white blood cells across 26 mammalian species. Those with more total sleep time have higher numbers of white blood cells. And so that's one of the first responses of the acquired immunity. And a 10-hour increase in sleep time is associated with a 24-fold decrease in parasiticism. So meaning that the more mammals are, the longer total sleep time mammals have, the better they are at fighting parasites. Okay. And here we have two different brain chemicals that are associated with, one is associated with acquired immunity, and one is associated with innate immunity. And the interleukin 12 is the one that is highly associated with creating this immunological memory to a pathogen such as a virus. And what you see, again, This is time on the x-axis, and the gray is when you're sleeping. And the white is people who are not sleeping, and the black is people who are sleeping. And what you can see is that this, during sleep, you have this very strong increase in interleukin, which also supports inflammatory processes, which allows you to build a response to the pathogen. And you do not have this response at all when you are awake. So this is very much a sleep-specific response. And you don't really see, interferon is more related to our innate immunity. You don't really see a very sleep-specific effect there. There's this idea that sleep is very important for learning, right? And so we look at learning in the brain as a cognitive learning, but people who are looking at psychoimmunology, they're looking at this as a sleep-dependent immunological memory that you have to form, and it forms during sleep. This is a really crazy study, and there's a whole bunch of them now. And there's these, I mean, who thought of this? So this guy Cohen, he takes healthy people who has a range of different prior sleep, sometimes not slept well, sometimes they've slept well, and he puts them in these isolated quarantine, and then gives them nasal spray with viruses, and then they wait and see who gets sick. I guess you probably are not surprised to hear that the shorter the sleep the week before leads to greater susceptibility to the virus. This is actigraphy data, meaning this is a watch that they wore the week before, so they can tell how long, how many hours they were sleeping, how many minutes they were sleeping. And you can see that anything, when we're going from below 7, your viral susceptibility increases. So having good sleep is actually a primer to being less susceptible to the virus, right? So that you become more immunologically competent if you have had good, solid sleep. And I'm sure that we could talk for hours about what is the background of this, but I think it's a super important point to make. There's other research that is also looking at how sleep benefits the, once you've been given the vaccine, how strongly you respond to the vaccine in terms of how quickly you can build up an immunological response. That is also correlated with how much sleep you get, and specifically how much slow wave sleep you get, which is that first part of the night of sleep. So this is, I think, a really important new area, growing area to be investigating. All right, this is my stupid joke, locking it down. I'm just going to give it a summary of what we just talked about. So COVID is changing our sleep. It's getting better for some, worse for others, definitely increasing our nightmares. Poor sleep, if you're one of those who have poor sleep, it can definitely be impacting us emotionally, cognitively, and it degrades our health by degrading our ability to respond to stress. And of course, everybody is pretty stressed right now. Poor sleep also increases our susceptibility to pathogens, particularly viruses, bacteria, many different foreign bodies coming into our body. So what can we do? I wanted to end on a positive note, and I'm going to rush through this because I'm sure we probably want to get to the questions, but there's basically 3 different aspects of your body and mind that you need to be considering when you think about how to benefit your sleep. The first one is just thinking about your sleep in general. You want to get early to bed. You want to avoid late naps because that takes in that kind of creeps into your nighttime sleep, your early slow wave sleep. So don't nap after, say, 5 o'clock. Definitely be up by, say, 3, I think 3 or 4. And only drink caffeine in the morning, stop by noon. Stop having any liquids, especially older adults are very, very sensitive to liquids 4 hours before bedtime. So really you've got to cut that out, or you're going to be up in the middle of the night and it's going to make your sleep more restless. Aerobic exercise is incredibly important for increasing slow wave sleep, but it has to be in the morning. So morning exercise and intensive morning exercise is going to really benefit your slow wave sleep. If you do it too late in the evening, you're going to have high temperature, body temperature, which is actually hard to get to sleep. Light boxes, we are now heading into summer, so California obviously is not a big of a deal, but you never, I mean, I think New York has been in like days and days of rain. It's super depressing. Having your circadian rhythm have an early morning bright light marker is incredibly important for your circadian rhythm to know that it's time to be awake. And people who are indoors all the time receive like 10% of the light that they need for their circadian rhythm. And it makes it very hard to stay alert during the day and then to sleep during the night. So light boxes actually have been shown to really consolidate sleep. Try to keep a consistent schedule. Try to use your screen filters so that you don't have the blue light coming in, or get the blue light glasses. And then lastly is the autonomic nervous system. The autonomic nervous system is probably one of the most important restorative functions that we have. And it's highly, highly enhanced during slow wave sleep, during that early slow wave sleep. So you really want to be getting that slow wave sleep and try to get into that deep early sleep. But you can also enhance the autonomic nervous system and all the benefits of that by doing meditation, deep breathing, aerobic exercise. Same with sleep. If you do early morning aerobic exercise, you're stimulating your sympathetic nervous system, which is going to have the benefit of stimulating your parasympathetic rest and digest later in the evening. More afternoon exercise, later afternoon, is going to have the opposite effect. So you want to be careful of that if that's something that you're sensitive to. Connecting in nature, being out in nature is very important. Holding hands, being with your loved ones, intimacy, all of that stuff is also really important to make you feel safe and loved and connecting with community. Okay, I think that I'm ready to tie up, and I just want to say that, of course, sleep is not, obviously now you've seen everybody sleeps slightly differently. We need to make sure that we don't think that there's one way to do it. Through self-inquiry, now you have a lot of time on your hands to find out what is your best way of sleeping. Make sure that you really test what works for you. And it could be something that you could take into, you know, the post-COVID time, right? Is maybe you really are a night person and it's best for you to have that shifted. So pay attention to that. And most important is that sleep is not the silver bullet, right? You have to take care of your nutrition, make sure you're exercising every day properly, do the meditation, do your deep breathing, try to, as much as you can, to have stress reduction. All these things work together. And so we need to consider ourselves one whole body and mind. Okay, and I just want to thank you so much for listening.
Well, thank you, Sarah. This is just fascinating. And there's, I mean, just a delight to learn so much about sleep in relation to what's happening right now with all of us, but also just in general to think about kind of better sleep habits for beyond this pandemic. Now, there's a number of questions have come in. I wanted to start with one that's relevant to some of our students. And that is that, you know, as you know, some of our international students have gone home and they are in many different time zones. And I know at least one of my students who is in Korea, where it's like almost 4 in the morning now, has been trying to stay on Pacific time for classes, but also to feel more connected to people here and her friends and so forth. What do you have to say about that?
It's a really hard, I mean, I get how important it is to stay connected to the place that you're actually having to connect to, and especially when your classes are in the middle of the night where you are. I do think that we're in a time right now where there's a lot that can be made such that you don't have to necessarily go to all of your classes when they're held. And I think that's one of the benefits that UCI is really creating is less stringentness in terms of having people show up to class. And so I would say for people who are in a foreign area where it is outside the California time, you should be in sync with the time that you're in, because that's when the sunlight is going to give you your biggest bang for your buck. There's really nothing you can do that is going to be as good as the sun in the morning, and eating during the middle of the day and not eating at night. Your body is paying attention to your environment. It is not paying attention to what your advisor tells you to do, right? So you need to really think more about what your body needs, and the community that you have in your present world around you, in your real world around you, is more supportive for your body and mind than the virtual world. So I understand wanting to stay connected, but I think it's also important to really connect with what's around you physically, and to, reach out to those people more so, and then make it such that you keep up with things, but in a delayed fashion, and everyone is going to understand. And I think I would really, send them to me if they don't.
There's a couple of questions from folks with kids, with a 12-year-old and another questioner with a 15-year-old. So the 12-year-old is now sleepwalking, and the 15-year-old, this is a different parent with a 15-year-old, has sort of turned her days and nights upside down. So like sleeping all day and staying up all night, but still getting 8 to 10 hours. So yeah. What's up with that?
So the 15-year-old isn't exactly that, phase delay, right? And they've just kind of gone all in terms of buying into their own best sleep rhythm. It's a hard one, right? Because it's so emotionally difficult to feel so out of sync with your child, and to have them not be present when you are, and to have them also just be doing something that looks so weird, right? So at the same time, this may be an interesting experiment for the 15-year-old to give it a try. Eventually this is going to wear off, and they will become back to the living, but I think it is an interesting time to allow this 15-year-old to explore what is it like. The issue there is that there is a little bit of, I worry a little bit about the emotionality aspect of it, because it's harder to have support if everyone is asleep when you're awake, and it's harder to communicate if you're just out of sync with each other. So maybe creating really strong boundaries around communication, and at the same time, like have it be an agreement, like a contract, where like, okay, this is what you're going to do, and we're going to, but you have to do it in a way that works for our sanity too. So I that's kind of the way I would, approach it. And with the sleepwalker, I think that, as long as they're safe, there's probably, people who sleepwalk, usually when they're more stressed, they will sleepwalk more. So there is probably a component of stress that is enhancing the sleepwalking. I would then, try to do interventions during the day when the person is awake, and trying to really talk to them about, like, are they getting enough exercise? Are they doing processing of their emotions? Are they getting enough bright light? Trying to maybe wear them out during the day, and keep them off the screens, and so they really feel like, and that's of course really hard at that age, but the more you can kind of get them not anxious or not stressed, I think will decrease their sleepwalking.
Great, thank you. There's a couple other questions here that have to do with exercise. One is, are our walks in the evening a bad idea because you're getting some aerobic exercise later in the day? Another question is for people with teenagers who are used to evening aerobic activities like dance and soccer, like between 5 and 8 or whatever. what about that? And this person has a child. One of their children seems to be experiencing a sleep pattern disruption. So the questioner asked, should I focus on trying to get her to participate in aerobic activities in the evening to get her back on track or not? So it's sort of the exercise in the evening question.
Yeah, it's a really interesting point, right? Because one of the major cues for sleeping is a decrease in your body temperature. And when you have an elevated body temperature from exercise in the evening, it's harder to get to sleep. Except, you know, if this is a teenager, it's likely that they're already in a delayed sleep phase. And so their their evening exercise may kind of contribute to that delayed sleep phase. And it just may be part of their normal cycle. So not everything, you know, we're not all the same person, right? So when you're sensitive to when you're sensitive to evening exercise, you need to know that about yourself, and then maybe try to do and walking, I would say, is not going to interfere. It's the intensive, real cardio, the stuff that's going to high intensity workouts that are going to really jumpstart your sympathetic nervous system, because what it does is it takes a long time for the sympathetic nervous system to ramp down and for the parasympathetic nervous system to, in answer to the sympathetic nervous system ramping down, for the parasympathetic to ramp up. And that's where the more you have time for the parasympathetic system to ramp up, the more slow wave sleep you're going to have. So that is why I really suggest having your exercise in the morning to make sure you have the most consolidated, deepest sleep in the evening. But walking is not one of those things, like if you're just doing a nice brisk walk, but you're not like heavy breathing, super sweaty, I wouldn't discard that.
What about after evening exercise, taking a cool shower? Does that do anything?
Yeah, so that's another really good little trick, is to not a cool shower necessarily, but you can actually take even a warm shower, but go into a cool space. So the trick is to go from hot to cold, and so so you could take a cool shower, but I've always thought having a hot shower and then going into a cold room, having air conditioning, that is also something that is immediately you'll get really cold because you went from hot to cold. So whatever you can do to kind of shift your body temperature is going to, your body is kind of dumb, right? It just says, oh, okay, I guess time to sleep.
Great. You know, we're rapidly running out of time. There's a number of other questions, but we'll save those and we'll try to get you answers. Some people are posting some very specific questions about themselves, about their parents and so forth. There's sort of a handful of them. So I think we can probably get them addressed after the session, but we do need to wrap up, unfortunately. Sara, thank you so much. One of our commenters has said the presentation was therapeutic in and of itself, and I completely agree.
Thank you.
I've got my pillow, I've got my Eeyore here. Thank you again. Thank you to Social Sciences Computing Services who have helped run this webinar and are recording it. It will be posted on the Social Sciences website later on. Thank you all for coming, and sleep well.